In the heart of a life marked by loss, Jim Harrison's world had slowed to a halt. With his retirement looming and his heart heavy with grief from the loss of his son, he didn't expect the call that would change everything. As a fire broke out at an old warehouse, Jim rushed in, not knowing that amidst the chaos, he would find a tiny German Shepherd puppy fighting for its life. In the midst of the flames, Jim unearthed not just a survivor, but a piece of his past, a gift from his son David. What he didn't know was that this small puppy, with its heart still beating through the smoke, would become his bridge back to hope. How did this puppy find its way into Jim's life, and what deeper connection does it share with his son? Watch the video to discover a story of redemption, healing, and the unexpected gift that came when Jim needed it most. Jim Harrison sat at the worn wooden desk of the Duluth Fire Department, staring at the clock ticking down the final hours of his career. 32 years of rushing into burning buildings, of saving lives, of standing shoulder to shoulder with his crew. All of it was about to be left behind. At 58, he was 2 days away from mandatory retirement, and yet there was no relief in sight. Instead, there was a strange emptiness that had settled deep in his chest. For over 3 decades, Jim had been the one people turned to when the flames raged, when danger loomed. But now, standing on the precipice of leaving it all behind, he felt hollow, like a building stripped of its walls. A life that had been lived in constant motion, but was now grinding to a halt. The routine, the rush of adrenaline, the bond he shared with his team, all of it was about to fade away. His hands, scarred and weathered from years of firefighting, trembled slightly as he poured another cup of coffee. It didn't feel like a celebration, it felt like an ending. The phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the quiet of the station. Jim's stomach tightened. The call was from Captain Sullivan, and the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. "Jim, we've got a fire at the old warehouse on Shore Drive. It's bad. Get your gear and meet us at the trucks." Jim's heart skipped a beat. Shore Drive. The street where his son David had lost his life 12 years ago. He hadn't been able to go near that stretch of road since the accident. The memories of that rainy night, of Maggie's frantic calls, of the empty seat in the car, were all still too fresh, too painful. He stood grabbing his jacket and helmet. His mind was already reeling, but the fire department needed him. His crew needed him. His steps were automatic as he walked out of the station, but a knot of dread twisted in his gut. The trucks roared to life, the sirens wailing into the cold February night. The city of Duluth, with its quiet streets and familiar landmarks, seemed different tonight. The air felt sharper, colder, as though the world was holding its breath. Jim sat in the back of Engine 7, the familiar rumble of the engine vibrating through his bones as they sped toward the fire. The snow outside whirled, catching the emergency lights in a dance of red and blue. The city he had spent his life in now felt like a strange, distant place. When they arrived at the warehouse, the sight was a harsh shock to the senses. The building, long abandoned and forgotten, was now a fiery inferno, its skeleton visible against the night sky. Flames leaped and twisted, clawing their way up the side of the structure, hungry and relentless. The heat from the fire was intense even from a distance, and the smoke billowed into the air like a dark cloud suffocating the night. Jim's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene, his mind already calculating their approach. The building was unstable, every second counted, but there was no time to waste on hesitation. "Let's go, Team Chassis!" Captain Sullivan shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. As Jim rushed to grab his gear, the familiar rush of duty flooded back. The fear, the adrenaline, the need to act. It was all there. The same emotions that had driven him for over 3 decades. Yet deep down, a quiet voice in the back of his mind wondered if this would be his last call, his last chance to prove himself in a job he loved but could no longer hold on to. He pushed the thought aside. Lives were at risk. His team was counting on him. The heat was unbearable as he entered the warehouse, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning wood. Jim could barely see, but his hands moved with practiced efficiency. He could hear the crackling of flames, feel the floor shift beneath his boots, but his focus remained sharp. There was always something dangerous, something unpredictable about every fire, but that was part of the job. It was what Jim did best. Then as he moved deeper into the warehouse, something caught his attention. A faint sound, a soft whimper barely audible over the chaos. Jim froze, his heart hammering in his chest. A whimper. In the middle of a burning building. He looked around, his eyes scanning the debris, the wreckage. What could it be? His instincts kicked in, and before he could think, his hands were pulling away chunks of wreckage, his eyes desperate for a sign. There, beneath the twisted metal and burning debris, something moved. Jim's breath caught in his throat. What he saw made his blood run cold. A small golden-brown patch of fur. Trembling. Alive. Jim's hands trembled as he carefully moved debris aside, his heart racing, the familiar feeling of urgency flooding his body. The fire was still raging around him, but the small patch of fur he had uncovered seemed like a distant reality compared to the heat and chaos of the warehouse. He could feel the weight of each moment pressing on him, the tension growing thicker in the air with every passing second. The small golden-brown bundle lay there, barely moving but alive. Jim knelt down, his hands shaking as he cradled the fragile puppy in his arms, trying to shield it from the intense heat. But as he held the puppy close, a memory hit him with the force of a wrecking ball. It had been 12 years, but the pain of losing his son David felt as fresh as ever. Jim's mind wandered back to that rainy April night, the night that had changed everything. He could still see the flashing lights of the ambulance, the frantic whispers of doctors, the empty space at the dinner table, and Maggie's tear-streaked face. David, his only son, had been everything to him. Bright, thoughtful, kind-hearted, always trying to make everyone around him happy. Jim remembered the excitement in David's voice when he talked about his dreams, the way he smiled when he mentioned his future plans. It was all cut short that night. David's life, his dreams, all snatched away in the blink of an eye. The truck driver had fallen asleep at the wheel, and David never stood a chance. The grief that followed had been a suffocating weight, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Jim never truly processed it. Instead, he buried his pain in the job and the fires he fought and the lives he saved. But deep down, it was as if a part of him had died with David. Maggie, too, had been swallowed by the grief. They tried to move on to rebuild, but it was never the same. They didn't know how to speak about David, how to fill the silence that had taken over their lives. Slowly, over the years, the distance between Jim and Maggie grew. They stopped talking about their son, stopped talking at all. The house, once filled with laughter, now echoed with an emptiness neither of them knew how to fix. Maggie had stopped wearing the smiles Jim used to love so much, and Jim had become a ghost in his own life. The weight of loss had consumed him, and his relationship with Maggie had deteriorated in the shadow of it. They both carried the burden in silence. Maggie worked part-time at the library, her days quiet and uneventful, just like her existence now. Jim threw himself into his work, doing everything to avoid confronting the hollow space inside him. The love they once shared was fading like a photograph left too long in the sun, its colors fading until it was just a blur of memory. And now, as he held the trembling puppy in his arms, Jim couldn't help but feel a deep, aching reminder of everything he had lost. The puppy's warmth against his chest felt like the smallest fleeting glimmer of hope in a world that had become so unbearably cold. But even as he fought to hold back the tears, there was something different about this moment. Maybe it was the way the puppy's fragile heartbeat fluttered against his chest, a small life clinging to existence. Maybe it was the fact that in some strange way this puppy was a gift from David, a final plan that his son had put into motion long before Jim had realized it. Jim pressed the puppy closer, taking in its warmth and scent, and for the first time in 12 years he allowed himself to feel something other than pain. It wasn't much, but it was something. The fire had been contained, but the devastation was far from over. Jim's crew continued to sift through the smoldering remains of the warehouse. The smoke still hung in the air like a heavy blanket, but the immediate danger had passed. The sharp crackle of flames had been replaced by the dull creak of twisted metal and the crunch of debris beneath their boots. They moved carefully, methodically, as they searched for anyone still trapped or any sign of life amidst the destruction. Jim moved with the precision of a man who had seen it all. His instincts were sharp, his senses heightened. But today, something felt different. As he picked his way through the wreckage, a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A small, golden-brown shape shifting beneath the rubble. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be another person? He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he brushed away chunks of burnt wood and metal. The cold air bit at his exposed skin, but it didn't matter. His mind was focused on the small patch of fur that was just barely visible. It was a puppy. The tiny German Shepherd pup lay there, its body scorched by the fire, one leg bent unnaturally beneath it. Its breathing was shallow, labored, but it was alive. Jim's breath caught in his throat as he cradled the small animal, gently lifting it out from beneath the debris. Its eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain and smoke, but there was a spark of life in them. Jim could hardly believe what he was seeing. How could something so fragile survive in this inferno? The fire had torn through the building, leaving nothing but a shell of twisted metal and blackened walls. Yet here it was, this tiny creature barely clinging to life against all odds. As he examined the pup, his fingers brushed against something small and cold beneath its fur. He shifted the puppy in his arms, and there, attached to its collar, was a small metal tag. Jim's heart stopped when he read the inscription DH-K9 Training Unit. The initials were unmistakable. DH, David Harrison, his son's name. The realization hit Jim like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just any dog, it wasn't just a stray or a casualty of the fire. This dog had a purpose that David had planned for 12 years ago before he died. Jim's mind reeled as he tried to process the shock. The small puppy struggling for breath in his arms was a part of a plan his son had set in motion long before Jim had even realized it. David had known. David had somehow foreseen that Jim would need someone to pull him out of the darkness, to give him a reason to keep going after his retirement. And so David had bought this dog, had arranged for it to be trained, and had made sure it would be there when Jim needed it the most. Jim's hands shook as he held the puppy close, feeling the fragile warmth of its body against his chest. For the first time in 12 years, something other than pain flooded through him. Hope. The smallest flicker of hope, but it was there. The puppy looked up at Jim with its cloudy, exhausted eyes, as if it knew that this man, this stranger, was its last chance at survival. Jim pressed it gently against his chest, trying to warm it, protect it from the cold of the warehouse and the cold that had settled deep in his heart for so many years. This puppy, this tiny creature, was the bridge between the past and the future, between the man Jim had been and the man he still could become. Jim sat in the back of the ambulance, his eyes never leaving the small, trembling puppy in his arms. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on him, but as the paramedics worked around him, Jim's mind was somewhere else. His hands still shook from the shock, and he couldn't stop thinking about the tiny metal tag on Blaze's collar. DH-K9 Training Unit. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. Jim had never imagined that something so small, so seemingly insignificant, would carry with it such an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The initials burned in his mind. DH. His son's initials. David. The connection was undeniable, but it made no sense. How could this puppy have anything to do with David? Jim knew his son had always been full of surprises, but this felt like more than just a coincidence. David had been gone for 12 years, yet here he was, his son's final act of love staring him in the face in the form of a tiny puppy. As the ambulance sped toward the clinic, Jim's thoughts began to unravel the mystery. David had always been perceptive, insightful beyond his years. Even at 16, David had known Jim better than Jim had known himself. His son had seen the struggles Jim faced, the emptiness he would eventually feel after retirement, and he had made a plan that Jim hadn't even known about. David must have known that Jim would need something to live for after he stepped away from the job, something to keep him grounded, to pull him out of the darkness he was sure to fall into once the sirens stopped, once the fires went out. And so David had arranged it all, the purchase of the puppy, the training, the final piece of a plan he had set into motion long before Jim had any idea. Jim couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the realization his son had thought of everything. David had known that the hardest part of his life would come after the uniform came off, after the last fire was put out. He had planned for Jim's loneliness, his pain, his potential loss of purpose. David had seen it all, and he had found a way to ensure his father wouldn't be left to face it alone. But there was more, much more, that Jim couldn't yet understand. How had David arranged for this puppy to be placed in his life? How had he made sure that Blaze would find its way to Jim 12 years after his death? Had he known that Jim would find it in the wreckage of this fire at the moment when he needed it most? The more Jim thought about it, the more questions piled up in his mind. How had David planned all of this? Had he known the fire would lead him to this moment, or had it all been a coincidence? One thing was certain, though. Blaze was no ordinary puppy. It wasn't just a dog. It was a lifeline, a piece of his son that had made it through the fire just like Jim had survived his own personal infernos. Jim looked down at Blaze, who had fallen silent in his arms, its little chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. He couldn't help but feel a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude for David. His son had known what he needed even when Jim had no idea. Blaze wasn't just a gift. It was a message from a son who had never stopped caring even after his death. As Jim sat in the clinic's dimly lit waiting room, the tiny puppy nestled in his arms, the world around him seemed quieter than it had been in years. Blaze was resting its small body, trembling slightly from the ordeal, but Jim couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of duty he now felt. The puppy, fragile and scarred from the fire, seemed to cling to him like a lifeline. Every shallow breath it took, every slight twitch of its tiny paws only deepened Jim's resolve to care for it. But while Jim focused on Blaze, a surprising twist of fate was unfolding outside of the clinic. A police officer walked into the waiting room looking uncomfortable, his eyes shifting as he approached Jim. The officer's face was one Jim had seen many times before. It was Dennis Walsh, a former firefighter and Jim's old colleague from years ago. Dennis, once a strong, reliable firefighter like Jim, had always been a man of few words. Jim had known him well. Dennis had been an exemplary member of the team until the night tragedy struck. It was when Dennis's daughter Sarah had died in a house fire that things began to change. After the loss, Dennis had become a shadow of the man he once was. He stopped coming to work, his eyes hollow with grief. Jim had watched his old friend spiral, unsure of how to help him. No one had expected that years later Dennis would reappear at a fire not to save lives, but to test himself. Jim's heart sank as the officer's presence became clearer. It wasn't just a coincidence that Dennis was here. Dennis had been linked to a string of recent arson cases, fires that had been set deliberately with eerie precision. Fires where no one had been hurt, but the buildings had been left to burn, consumed by flames. The fires seemed too coordinated to be random, too careful for a person just trying to cope with grief. And as the officer continued speaking, it became clear Dennis had been involved in setting these fires. The revelation hit Jim like a gut punch. He had known Dennis was struggling, but he never imagined that his friend would go to such extremes. Dennis had always been haunted by his daughter's death. After losing her in a tragic fire, he'd been unable to move forward, unable to escape the crushing guilt. But what Jim couldn't understand was why Dennis had been setting fires. Why, after all these years, had he chosen to cause destruction? As the officer explained the connections between the fires, Jim's thoughts began to unravel. It wasn't just that Dennis was trying to get over the loss of his daughter. It seemed as though Dennis had been trying to prove something to himself, to test his courage, to redeem the failure he felt for not being able to save Sarah. He had been using fire, something so familiar to him, to heal, to see if he could face the flames again and not freeze, not fail. Jim sat there, the weight of it all pressing down on him. How had Dennis ended up in this situation? What had become of the man Jim had once trusted, the man who had stood by him through so many fires? Then came the most unsettling realization. The most recent fire. The one at the abandoned warehouse had been set intentionally. And Blaze, this little puppy, this final gift from David, had been placed in that fire left to die along with the rest of the wreckage. Dennis had in some twisted way been responsible for bringing this puppy into Jim's life. Blaze was no accident. It was part of Dennis's desperate attempt to prove his bravery, his ability to survive. Jim's mind spun with questions. Could Dennis have known that Blaze would survive? Could he have planned for Jim to find this puppy, to find purpose again through it, just as David had planned for Jim to find the dog 12 years ago? Was this part of a larger plan, one orchestrated by a grieving man who had been too broken to see clearly? In the midst of all these questions, Jim's focus shifted back to the small puppy resting in his arms, Blaze. David's final gift. Jim had been given this chance. This second chance. But the truth about Dennis, the lies and the manipulation filled him with a heavy sense of dread. It wasn't just the fires he had to deal with now. It was the consequences of the secrets he had yet to uncover. Jim stood in the small, sterile examination room, Blaze nestled in his arms, the weight of the puppy's fragile body grounding him in a reality that felt all too heavy. His mind, though focused on the task at hand, kept drifting back to the past, back to a time when everything seemed possible before the fire that had stolen so much from him. David's death had shattered everything. The boy, full of promise and life, had been taken in an instant. It felt as though with David's death, the future had been stolen from Jim and Maggie as well. The dreams they had for their son, the plans for the years ahead evaporated into nothing, leaving only the silence of their home and the crushing weight of loss. After the accident, Jim and Maggie had tried. They had tried to move on, to rebuild something of their broken lives. But no matter how hard they tried, something always remained fractured, like a cracked vase that could never be repaired. They had drifted apart slowly, the rift between them widening as time went on. They didn't know how to talk about their son, how to mourn together. The silence in their home grew heavier each day. Jim remembered those long nights after David's funeral when he would stand in the doorway of David's room, his hand resting on the doorframe, unable to bring himself to go inside. The room was untouched, just as it had been the day David left. Posters of firefighters and rescue dogs still adorned the walls. His desk, cluttered with books about canine training, remained exactly as it had been when he was alive. The clothes still hung in the closet, and Jim couldn't bear to part with them. Every inch of that room felt sacred, but stepping inside felt like trespassing on the memory of a life that had been taken too soon. Jim had never dared to move anything, afraid that doing so would erase the last remnants of his son. The room had become both a shrine and a prison, keeping David alive in ways Jim couldn't explain. Each time he stood there looking at the things his son had left behind, he felt an overwhelming mix of grief and guilt, as if he was failing David by not finding a way to heal. He didn't know how to move on, how to fill the emptiness left by David's absence. And Maggie had been carrying her own pain in silence. She worked at the library, a quiet, mundane job that seemed to offer no solace. She was distant, not just physically but emotionally, retreating into herself, perhaps because she didn't know how to be with Jim anymore. They had both been consumed by their grief, but neither of them knew how to face it together. Maggie had stopped trying, and so had Jim. It was as if their shared pain had formed an invisible wall between them, one that neither of them knew how to break down. Jim's thoughts lingered on the last conversation he had with Maggie before he left for the fire. She hadn't spoken much. There had been no goodbye or "I love you" in her voice. Just the distant sound of someone who had long ago given up on expecting things to change. Jim had learned to live with that silence, but it still cut him every time. Now, with Blaze in his arms, it was as if David's ghost had returned, offering Jim a final chance at redemption, a gift from beyond the grave, a small, fragile puppy who carried with it the hopes and dreams Jim had lost. He didn't know how to explain it, but he felt it. This small creature trembling in his arms was the bridge between the past and the future. As Jim looked down at Blaze, a flicker of light broke through the cloud of grief that had surrounded him for so long. It wasn't much, but it was something. a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way back from the darkness. For the first time in years, Jim felt like he could breathe. The call came in fast and urgent, interrupting the silence that had settled over Jim and Blaze. The voice on the other end of the radio crackled with tension. "Engine 7, we have a structure fire at Riverside Towers. Multiple floors involved. Possible occupants trapped. Get moving." Now Jim's stomach tightened. Riverside Towers. A high-rise apartment building. Another fire, another chance to act, but this time something felt different. The urgency in the captain's voice, the mention of possible victims, especially a child. It hit too close to home. He looked down at Blaze, who was alert and his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion from their earlier ordeal. The bond between them had already begun to grow, and Jim could feel it. Blaze was ready. The small puppy, so fragile just hours ago, was now the partner Jim never knew he needed. "Let's go, boy," Jim whispered, securing Blaze's harness and setting him on the ground. "We have work to do." The fire engines roared to life, speeding through the streets with sirens, wailing lights flashing in the winter night. The city outside seemed distant, but the adrenaline of the rescue quickly consumed Jim. His thoughts flashed back to the days when David had been full of life, when Jim had been more than just a firefighter. He had been a father, a husband, a man with purpose, but the fire always pulled him back. It had been his escape and his curse. As they arrived at Riverside Towers, Jim's eyes scanned the building. Flames were leaping from the third and fourth floors, windows shattered, and thick black smoke poured from the upper floors like an angry beast. The building's structure groaned under the stress, and Jim knew time was running out. He turned to Blaze, who stood next to him, looking up at him with a calm focus that Jim had never seen in any dog before. The fear was gone. All that remained was determination. "Stay close, Blaze," Jim said firmly. "Let's save this little girl." They rushed to the building's entrance. Smoke greeted them immediately, thick and suffocating, but Jim's training kicked in. He pulled his helmet down over his face, and Blaze followed closely behind him, his nose twitching as he searched for the scent of the child. The smoke was thick, but Blaze's trained instincts took over. The puppy's nose twitched, and his ears pricked up. With Jim following closely, Blaze moved forward, his small body darting through the haze like a beacon of hope. The puppy was a natural, his steps quick and purposeful despite his size. He wasn't a typical canine yet, but the training he had gone through and David's careful planning made him capable of incredible things. Jim's heart pounded as they made their way up the stairs, Blaze leading the way. They reached the third floor where the flames were fiercest, and Jim's eyes caught the faint outline of a small figure through the thick smoke. "Lily." Jim called out, his voice hoarse. "Lily, we're coming for you." Blaze stopped in his tracks, his head cocked slightly. He moved towards the wall, nose pressed to the burning surface, then began barking urgently, pawing at the dry wall. Jim followed quickly, his heart racing. This was it. He knew it. Blaze had found her. With one powerful shove, Jim smashed through the drywall, revealing a small hidden space behind it. There, curled up, and unconscious from smoke inhalation, lay a tiny girl with brown pigtails, Lily Patterson. Jim's hands were trembling as he scooped her up, his arms cradling her fragile body against his chest. He could feel her light frame limp and cold. He checked for a pulse, weak but steady. Relief flooded over him, but it wasn't enough. They needed to get out and fast. "Blaze, lead the way," Jim urged, already starting back toward the stairwell. The smoke was growing heavier, the heat unbearable, but Jim didn't stop. Blaze's eyes were locked on him, and the puppy's tail swished as he ran ahead, guiding Jim through the chaos. They reached the stairwell just as a loud crash sounded behind them. The floor beneath them creaked and groaned. Jim's lungs burned, the heat choking him with every breath. But Blaze, undeterred, didn't falter. He kept running, leading Jim down the stairs toward the safety of the ground floor. Just as they reached the exit, a massive explosion ripped through the building. The force sent Jim stumbling forward, but he shielded Lily's small body with his own. Blaze yelped in pain as debris struck him, but he kept moving. Jim's eyes were locked on the exit every step of battle. They burst through the door into the cold night air, and paramedics swarmed around them. The sound of emergency vehicles filled the air, and the heat of the fire finally began to dissipate. Jim collapsed onto the grass outside, still holding Lily tightly, his breath ragged, his body sore. He had done it. They had done it. Blaze, though battered, sat beside him, his tail wagging weakly. Jim's heart swelled with gratitude, pride, and a new, unfamiliar feeling, hope. The puppy had saved a life, and in doing so had saved Jim too. The cold air outside Riverside Towers felt like a fresh start as it rushed past Jim's face. The chaos of the fire, the explosion, and the rescue had taken its toll, but in the aftermath there was a strange sense of peace. Jim's heart still pounded in his chest, his body aching from the physical strain, but there was something else, something profound stirring deep within him. The small, fragile form of Lily Patterson lay in his arms now in the hands of paramedics, and Jim felt a rush of relief as he watched them tend to her. Her pulse was steady, her breathing less labored. She was going to be okay. For a moment, Jim allowed himself to let go of the weight he had carried for so long, the weight of grief, of loss, of the past. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe, like he could hope again. And then, amidst the relief, there was Blaze. The small puppy, battered but alive, had stayed by his side throughout the ordeal. Jim turned to look at Blaze, who was still panting, its small frame showing signs of exhaustion, but its eyes were alert and filled with the kind of trust that only a dog could offer. Jim reached down and gently stroked the dog's fur, gratitude swelling in his chest. The puppy had done more than just save Lily's life. It had given Jim a reason to keep going. It had pulled him from the brink, made him believe in something again, in the possibility of healing and redemption. "Good boy, Jim," whispered softly, his voice thick with emotion. Blaze's tail thumped weakly, and Jim felt a deep sense of connection with the dog, one that went beyond words. As the emergency crew took Lily to the waiting ambulance, Jim's eyes shifted to a familiar face, Dennis Walsh. The sight of Dennis standing at the edge of the scene, his face drawn and weary, brought a sharp pang to Jim's chest. It had been years since they'd spoken, and Jim hadn't expected to see Dennis here, especially after everything that had happened. Dennis met Jim's eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The weight of unspoken words hung in the air between them, a silence filled with years of unresolved tension, grief, and guilt. Finally, Dennis spoke, his voice rough. "Jim, I don't know how to say this, but I owe you an explanation." Jim took a deep breath, his mind still reeling from the events of the night, from the explosion, from the small puppy in his arms, and from the weight of his own pain. "Go on," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving Dennis. Dennis paused, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. I've been doing something. I've been setting fires, Jim. Not just accidents. I've been trying to prove something to myself, trying to find my courage again." Jim's heart skipped a beat. The words were so raw, so unexpected. "What do you mean?" Jim asked, his voice thick with confusion. "I've been trying to find a way to make up for Sarah's death." Dennis said, his voice breaking slightly. "After she died in that fire, I froze. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't save her. And that broke me. So I have been setting these fires, Jim. Not to hurt anyone, but to test myself, to see if I could face the flames again and not freeze, to see if I could be brave like I used to be, like I should have been, when Sarah needed me most." Jim stood there speechless for a moment, his mind processing the revelation. He had known that Dennis had struggled, but he hadn't known the depth of his pain, the lengths he had gone to in order to cope with his guilt. Finally, Jim spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "You didn't have to do it this way, Dennis. You didn't have to destroy things to find yourself again." "I know," Dennis whispered, his head hung low. I'm sorry, I never meant to hurt anyone, but I was lost. I thought if I could just face the fire again, if I could just prove to myself that I could save someone else, that maybe it would make up for what I did." Jim took a deep breath, looking at Dennis with a mixture of anger and compassion. He could feel the weight of the past between them, but he could also feel the raw honesty in Dennis's words. "I can't say I forgive you right now," Jim said slowly, his gaze unwavering. "But I understand, and that's a start." Dennis looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Jim. I never expected this from you." Jim nodded. "We all carry our burdens, Dennis, but it's never too late to start carrying them differently. You don't have to keep running from it." There was a long pause before Dennis spoke again. "I never meant for you to find out this way. I never meant for Blaze to get involved." Jim's eyes softened as he glanced down at the puppy in his arms. "David planned it, didn't he?" Jim said more to himself than Dennis. Dennis nodded, his expression clouded with guilt. "He did. He knew. He wanted you to have Blaze. He knew you'd need something to save you." The truth hit Jim like a wave, and for the first time in 12 years he allowed himself to feel something other than grief. He had been given a gift, one that had come from a place of deep love and painful loss. Blaze wasn't just a dog. It was a lifeline, a thread that connected him to his son, to his past, and now perhaps to a future he hadn't yet dared to imagine. Dennis stood there, his shoulders slumped with regret, the weight of his confession hanging heavily between them. The fire, the destruction, the twisted path he had walked, it had all come to this moment. Jim could see the rawness in his eyes, the vulnerability that came with admitting the darkest parts of his soul. "I've been running from this," Dennis said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought I could outrun my guilt, but it's been chasing me for years. I set those fires to test myself, to see if I could do what I failed to do that night with Sarah. I needed to feel like I wasn't a coward anymore. I couldn't face what happened to her. I couldn't face myself." Jim took a deep breath. The weight of Dennis's words was heavy, but the pain wasn't as sharp as it once would have been. Maybe it was because Jim had started to understand. Maybe it was because somewhere deep inside he recognized the same feelings of helplessness, of guilt, that he carried for years. The difference, though, was that Dennis had chosen to bury those feelings under flames while Jim had buried them in silence. "How could you think that setting fires was the answer?" Jim's voice was quiet, filled with both disbelief and compassion. "You couldn't save her, Dennis. No one could. But you still have a chance. You can still save yourself." Dennis's eyes watered, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if the shame of his actions weighed him down even further. "I thought if I could save someone, anything, I could make up for what I couldn't do. I couldn't save my daughter. But I thought maybe I could save someone else." Jim nodded slowly, feeling the words resonate with him more than he wanted to admit. He understood that feeling. The desperate need to fix what was broken, to somehow undo the hurt that haunted him. But the truth was, no one could undo the past. And there was no way to go back and save David, no way to undo the damage that had already been done. "You didn't have to go down this path," Jim said, his voice soft but firm. "We all have our battles, but we don't need to destroy things to prove we can win." Dennis nodded again, his face crumpling in sorrow. "I'm sorry, Jim. I didn't think about the consequences. I never wanted to hurt anyone." The silence between them stretched for a moment, both men lost in their thoughts. Jim looked at Blaze, who had moved slightly in his arms, still breathing steadily despite the trauma it had endured. The small puppy, so fragile, so broken in its own way, had become a symbol of resilience, of second chances. Jim could feel the connection growing stronger with each passing moment. The realization hit Jim once more. Blaze wasn't just a survivor of the fire. Blaze was a part of a plan. David's plan. A plan designed to help Jim heal, to pull him from the deep well of grief he'd been trapped in for over a decade. David had known exactly what his father would need when the time came for him to face life after the fire department. He had orchestrated it all, even in death. Blaze wasn't just a dog, it was a message, a lifeline from David, a bridge that connected Jim to his past and perhaps to a future he hadn't dared to imagine. Jim felt the weight of that realization in his chest, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something else. Pain, yes, but also a deep, aching gratitude. This was the plan his son had set in motion, and Jim had no choice but to honor it. He had been given a second chance, not just by Blaze, but by David. Turning back to Dennis, Jim's voice softened. I understand, Dennis. I don't know if I can fully forgive what you've done, but I understand why you did it. We all carry our burdens. We all have our ways of coping, but we don't have to carry them alone anymore. Dennis raised his head, his face filled with disbelief. You're not angry with me? Jim shook his head slowly. Anger won't change anything. I've carried enough of it for 12 years. It's time to let it go. Dennis's shoulders seemed to relax, the tension slowly easing from his body. I don't know if I can ever make things right, Jim, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying. Jim didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced down at Blaze, the small puppy still nestled in his arms. Jim could feel its warmth, its life, and in that moment he realized something profound. Life had a way of moving forward no matter how broken or scarred we were. Maybe it was time for Jim to do the same. Blaze's recovery was slow, but every day brought a new sign of strength. The tiny puppy, so fragile and weak when Jim had first found him in the wreckage, was now slowly finding his footing again. The burns on his small body were healing, and the limp in his leg was becoming less pronounced. But it wasn't just Blaze's physical recovery that Jim focused on. It was the way the puppy had become a steady presence in his life, filling a void that Jim hadn't even known existed. Every morning, Jim woke to Blaze's soft whines, his eager little face waiting for attention. It was as if the puppy had sensed the emptiness that had lingered in Jim's life for years. It wasn't just the dog that needed healing, it was Jim himself. And with every passing day, he began to feel a sense of peace. Small at first, but real. Blaze had become his anchor, pulling him out of the darkness that had been his constant companion. They spent hours together, Jim on the couch. Blaze curled up at his feet, his small body warm and comforting. Sometimes Jim would talk to the puppy, recounting stories of the old days with David, of the dreams he once had for his son's future. Other times, they sat in silence, just the soft sound of Blaze's breathing filling the room. It was during these moments that Jim realized how much he had missed this companionship, this unconditional trust, this sense of connection. The simple act of caring for Blaze became a lifeline. It wasn't just about the puppy's survival, it was about Jim's own survival. He was learning to live again, to open his heart to someone after so many years of shutting it all out. Blaze wasn't just a puppy, he was a symbol of redemption, of hope, and a reminder that life could go on even after the worst of losses. One evening, as Jim sat by the fire with Blaze nestled in his lap, he realized something he hadn't truly felt in years. He was no longer alone. Blaze had brought him back from the brink. For the first time since David's death, Jim felt connected to the world again. He wasn't just a man drifting through the motions of life. He was a father, a husband, and now a dog owner. Blaze had given him purpose, again, a reason to keep going, a reason to hope. But it wasn't just about Jim. As the days went by, he noticed subtle changes in Maggie, too. She had started to talk to him again in the small, tender ways they used to. When she came home from the library, she would pause to say hello to Blaze, her hand gently brushing over the puppy's fur. It wasn't much, but it was something. Slowly, they were rebuilding what had been broken between them. One afternoon, as Jim was preparing lunch, Maggie walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. She looked at Jim, then at Blaze, her eyes softening. "He's been good for you," she said quietly. Jim glanced up, surprised by the tenderness in her voice. He smiled, nodding. "Yeah, he's been good for both of us." Maggie nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the window. "Maybe we can start again. With him. With everything." Jim's heart tightened in his chest. Could they rebuild their life together? He wasn't sure, but with Blaze at his side, anything seemed possible. For the first time in years, Jim felt like there was hope for their marriage, for their future. Blaze had started the healing, but maybe, just maybe, together they could finish it. Jim stood in the kitchen, the weight of the decision pressing on his chest like 1,000 pounds. Blaze sat at his feet, his small body curled up on the floor, exhausted from a morning of play, but still looking up at Jim with trusting eyes. The puppy's presence, once a symbol of hope and healing, now felt like a reminder of a far more complicated reality. The decision Jim faced seemed insurmountable. How could he choose between saving the life of a dog that had brought him back to life and helping Maggie, his wife, who was fighting a battle of her own against cancer? The money Jim had set aside for his retirement was supposed to provide them with some security. It was supposed to be their future, a buffer for the uncertain years ahead. But now that same money stood between life and death, between Blaze's survival and Maggie's treatment. Jim had spent the morning poring over the veterinary bills, the numbers blurring in front of his eyes. The surgery Blaze needed, the treatment for the burns, and the therapy for his leg came with a hefty price tag, more than Jim had ever imagined. And then there was the cost of the long-term care. But as he looked down at Blaze, a soft whimper escaping the puppy's mouth as it shifted in its sleep, Jim couldn't help but feel a surge of love. This dog, this tiny creature, had already given him so much. He had brought him out of the darkness, given him something to live for. How could he let that go? But then there was Maggie. She had been diagnosed with cancer months ago, and the toll it had taken on her was becoming more and more apparent. Her treatment had drained their finances, and her prognosis wasn't getting any better. The doctor had warned them that the surgery and chemotherapy would be expensive, too expensive. They could barely afford the treatment she needed, let alone Blaze's. But how could Jim look at his wife, the woman he had been married to for 34 years, and deny her the chance to fight for her life? Maggie, Jim said quietly. His voice strained as he sat across from her at the kitchen table. I don't know what to do. Blaze, he needs surgery, and I can't stop thinking about it, but you need treatment too. We don't have enough for both. Maggie's eyes darkened, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything at first, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she processed his words. Jim watched her closely, waiting for her response, but all he could feel was the crushing weight of the decision hanging in the air between them. I don't want you to give up on him. Maggie finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I know how much Blaze means to you, Jim. He's been the reason you've been able to move forward. But what about me? What about the life we've built together? Jim's heart broke at her words. He could see the exhaustion in her face, the pain of knowing that the cancer was slowly taking its toll. He reached out and gently took her hand in his own heart heavy with the knowledge that this wasn't a decision he could make alone. Maggie, Jim's voice faltered. He wasn't sure how to explain it. I don't want to lose you, but I don't want to lose him either. I don't know if I can make this choice. Maggie squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with unshed tears. You don't have to make it alone, she said softly. I'll fight. I'll fight with everything I have. But you need to decide. What are you going to do? The words echoed in Jim's mind as the weight of the choice loomed over him. He loved Maggie. He couldn't deny that. She had been his rock for so many years, but Blaze in his own way had brought him back from the edge. He had shown Jim that there was still hope, that life could still have meaning even after so much loss. Jim sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. The decision wasn't one he could make lightly, and it wasn't one he could make without knowing what was at stake. His heart ached for both of them. Maggie, his wife, and Blaze, the dog that had become so much more than just a pet. Maybe we can find a way to make it work, Jim said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe there's a way to save both of you. Maggie's gaze softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jim saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. Jim couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right about the fire at Riverside Towers. His mind kept circling back to the strange circumstances surrounding the blaze. The way it had spread so quickly, the intensity of the flames and the unexplained noises. There had to be more to the story. It couldn't have been just another random accident. Not with everything that had been happening, not with the pattern that was beginning to emerge in his thoughts. He sat in the dimly lit living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Blaze was curled up at his feet, resting quietly. Maggie had gone to bed early, exhausted from the day's strain. Jim hadn't been able to sleep, though. His thoughts kept drifting back to the fire, the peculiar details, the intensity, and most of all the suspicion that something more was at play. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. The warehouse fire had been too precise, too deliberate. The flames had been fueled by something other than just the building's contents. Jim had seen enough fires to know when something wasn't right. The burn patterns, the way certain materials had ignited faster than others, and the way the fire had been set up to spread rapidly. It wasn't an accident. Jim picked up the phone, his mind made up. He needed to know the truth. He needed to understand why this fire felt different, why it felt like he had been drawn into something bigger, something darker. He dialed Captain Sullivan's number, the phone ringing through the silence of the house. It only took a few seconds for Sullivan's familiar voice to crackle through. "Jim? What's up?" "I need to know more about that warehouse fire, the one we responded to." Jim's voice was firm, but there was a layer of urgency beneath it. "Something doesn't sit right with me. I think it was arson." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Sullivan's voice lowered. "You're not wrong. We've been getting some leads. We suspect it wasn't an accident either. We've got a team investigating." "Do you think Dennis was involved?" Jim asked, his heart pounding in his chest. It was the only thing that made sense. The way everything seemed to connect, the way Dennis had been acting, the fire, the puppy. Dennis Sullivan repeated, a little taken aback. "Why would you say that?" Jim exhaled slowly, rubbing his eyes. "It's just a feeling. I've been thinking about him, about his history, his pain, and I'm starting to wonder if all of this is connected." Sullivan sighed heavily. "I can't speak for Dennis, but I will tell you this. There's more to the story than we thought. We've uncovered evidence of accelerants in the warehouse. And from what we've pieced together, this wasn't just a random fire. Whoever set it had a specific purpose." Jim's stomach twisted. "So you're saying someone set that fire on purpose?" "It looks like it," Sullivan replied. "We're still working on the details, but it's definitely not the first time. We've found similar patterns in other fires over the past few months. This one was just bigger, more dangerous." Jim's mind raced as he processed the information. The more he thought about it, the more he realized the terrible truth. Dennis had been involved in more than just this one fire. There had been others. Fires set deliberately, like the one that had taken David's life. Like the one that had now drawn Jim into the web of deception. He put the phone down slowly, his heart heavy. This wasn't just about Blaze, about saving a dog or helping his wife. It was about something much bigger. Something that had been building for years, fueled by guilt, grief, and a desperate need for redemption. Jim stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the snowy street. He thought about Dennis, about the man he once knew, the man who had become a stranger. How could he have gotten so lost? How could he have fallen so far? The answer was simple, though. Grief. It had a way of consuming people, twisting them, pushing them to do things they would never have thought possible. Jim had to face the truth now. He had to confront the reality that his old friend Dennis was behind these fires, and that the path to redemption wasn't just about saving Blaze. It was about confronting the past, understanding the brokenness that had led them both here, and finding a way to move forward. The days following the revelation about Dennis were filled with tension, but they paled in comparison to the storm Jim was facing at home. Maggie's cancer had taken a toll on both of them, physically, emotionally, and financially. The weight of it was crushing. Jim could feel the strain in every conversation, every glance they exchanged, even in the quietest moments. The house that once echoed with the sound of laughter now held an uncomfortable silence, one that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Maggie had always been the stronger one, the one who held things together when everything else seemed to fall apart. But now, she was the one who needed help. The treatments were grueling, and despite the small successes, the physical toll it took on her was undeniable. She had become frail, her once vibrant energy drained by the chemotherapy, her skin pale and fragile. The woman Jim had known and loved seemed like a shadow of her former self. Yet despite the sickness that ravaged her body, there was something else that flickered in Maggie's eyes, a fire, however faint. She was still fighting, still holding on to the hope that somehow they would get through this. But Jim saw the toll it was taking on her. It wasn't just the cancer, it was the fear, the loneliness, and the overwhelming uncertainty of what the future held. Jim, too, felt the weight of it all. The financial strain was unbearable. They had spent most of their savings on Maggie's treatment, and what was left wasn't enough. He had been forced to make difficult decisions balancing the cost of her medical bills with the expenses of life. Some days, he didn't know how he was going to make it through. The weight of responsibility seemed to crush him from all sides. But then there was Blaze. The puppy had become more than just a small dog in Jim's life. He was a lifeline, a constant source of comfort and companionship when everything else seemed uncertain. When Jim woke up to the heavy silence of the house, Blaze was there waiting at his feet with a wagging tail and eager eyes. When the weight of the world seemed too much to bear, Blaze would nuzzle against his leg, offering silent comfort. The puppy, despite its own struggles, seemed to understand Jim's pain, and in its own way, it helped him find the strength to keep going. Blaze became a symbol of resilience. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. And in doing so, he gave Jim a reason to push through the darkness. With every step Blaze took, with every little victory he achieved, Jim felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward for them both. As Maggie rested in the living room one evening, Blaze curled up beside her. Jim sat on the edge of the couch, looking at the two of them. The quiet moments were often the hardest. It wasn't just the physical battle Maggie was facing, but the emotional battle they both fought every day. They had to rebuild, to re-find each other amidst the pain. And sometimes it felt like they were losing ground, but with Blaze by their side, it didn't feel quite as impossible. Maybe we can make it through this, Jim thought to himself, his gaze shifting from Maggie to Blaze. The little puppy, his small body now filled with a quiet confidence, had helped them both face a new chapter. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long while, Jim felt like they weren't walking it alone. Maggie stirred her hand, gently brushing Blaze's head, and she smiled faintly. "He's been good for us," she said softly, her voice weak but warm with a glimmer of hope. Jim nodded, his heart aching with love for both of them. "We'll get through this," he whispered, more to himself than to Maggie. "We'll get through this together." Blaze's tail thumped softly against the floor, as if in agreement, and Jim knew deep down that the puppy had already become an integral part of their journey, a reminder that even in the hardest times there was always something worth fighting for. The silence between Jim and Maggie had stretched for far too long. It was an uncomfortable kind of silence, one filled with unspoken words, with everything they both carried, but never quite shared. For 12 years they had lived in the shadows of their grief, but neither of them had ever truly confronted it. Now, with Blaze by their side, something inside Jim stirred. It was as if the puppy had opened a door in their hearts that they had been too afraid to open before. Sitting beside Maggie, Jim watched her gently stroke Blaze's fur, the tender gesture a stark contrast to the heaviness in the room. She had always been the strong one, the one who held their world together when it felt like it was falling apart. But now she seemed so fragile, as if the years of quiet suffering had worn her down to the bone. Jim felt a deep ache for her, for everything she had endured in silence. He knew what he needed to do. He had to talk to her finally. They couldn't keep living like this, pretending that the silence wasn't suffocating them both. Maggie deserved more than that, and so did he. They both did. "Maggie," Jim said quietly, his voice hesitant as he reached for her hand. She turned her tired eyes toward him, her expression softening when she saw the concern in his. "Jim," her voice was small, almost fragile. I think we need to talk about everything." Jim began his words slow but deliberate. He took a deep breath before continuing. "About David, about how we've been living, about how much I've failed you, failed both of us." Maggie shifted slightly, but she didn't pull her hand away. Jim felt the weight of the years they'd spent in silence between them. It wasn't just the grief that had driven them apart, it was the way they had both dealt with it. Jim had buried himself in his work while Maggie had retreated into herself, both of them too proud, too scared to face what had happened together. I don't know where to start, Jim, Maggie said softly, her eyes looking distant. It's been so long, 12 years, and I don't know if we've really ever talked about it. I don't know if we ever really could. Jim nodded, his heart heavy with the truth of her words. We never did we? We've been living in this shell pretending that everything's okay, but it hasn't been okay. Not for either of us. She sighed, the sound full of years of suppressed emotion. I tried to move on, Jim, but I couldn't. I couldn't fill the hole that David left, and I know you couldn't either. But we've been pretending like we were okay, like we could just live like we were. Jim's throat tightened as he squeezed her hand gently. I've been so lost, Maggie. So lost in the guilt and the pain of losing David. I didn't know how to help you because I couldn't even help myself. And I didn't know how to help us. Maggie's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Jim thought she might pull away, but instead she leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought you died too, Jim. Not physically, but you stopped being the man I married. You stopped being the father to David that I knew you could be, and I didn't know how to reach you. I didn't know how to break through. Jim felt a lump in his throat. I'm sorry, Maggie. I should have been there. For you. For David. I should have found a way to be present to heal together instead of shutting everything out. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their shared pain hanging in the air. Blaze, sensing the shift in the room, crawled over to Maggie and nuzzled her hand. She smiled faintly, her fingers running through his fur, the simple act of affection pulling her back from the edge of her own sorrow. Jim watched them, a quiet understanding forming between them. The years of silence had been hard on both of them, but now, for the first time in what felt like forever, Jim felt like they were beginning to find each other again. He wasn't sure if they could fix everything that had been broken, but for the first time, he felt like it was worth trying. You're right, Jim said quietly. We need to heal together. I want to try. I want to rebuild what we've lost. Maggie nodded, her eyes meeting his for the first time in a long while. We'll try, Jim. We have to. For David, for ourselves, and for Blaze. Jim squeezed her hand, a small smile tugging at his lips. For all of us, he said, his voice filled with a new resolve. For all of us. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jim woke up with a sense of purpose. The days had begun to blur together after David's death, after the pain and the grief, but now something had changed. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. It was about finding the strength to move forward, to rebuild what had been broken, and to find joy in the smallest of things. And Blaze, the tiny puppy that had brought so much more than just companionship, was there by his side, helping him find his way back. Jim spent his mornings with Blaze, taking the puppy out for walks around the neighborhood. The cold February air was biting, but it didn't matter. Blaze's excitement was infectious, his little legs bounding through the snow, his tail wagging with abandon. Jim couldn't help but smile as he watched the puppy, so full of life despite everything he had been through. Blaze had survived the fire. He had fought through the odds, and now he was showing Jim how to do the same. Every day, Jim spent time with Blaze, teaching him basic commands. Sit, stay, come. The puppy picked it up quickly, his eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. Jim found himself laughing at Blaze's antics, at the way the little dog's ears perked up at every new sound, how he would chase after snowflakes as if they were the most exciting things in the world. Jim hadn't realized how much he had missed laughing until it happened again. The sound of his own voice, the feeling of joy bubbling up from deep inside. It was like a door had cracked open and light was beginning to seep through. Blaze wasn't just a dog. He was a reminder that life still had something to offer, that there was still beauty to be found in the world, even in the darkest of times. Jim had been so focused on the past, on the pain, on what he had lost, that he had forgotten how to live for the present. But now, with Blaze by his side, he was beginning to remember. He was beginning to find himself again. As the days passed, Jim began to feel more connected to the world around him. He started to reach out to friends he hadn't spoken to in years. He began to take Maggie's hand more often, share simple moments with her, like sitting together on the couch talking about things other than the pain that had defined so much of their relationship. It was slow, but it was progress, and it felt good. Blaze, with his innocent, unwavering trust, had shown Jim how to open his heart again. For the first time in years, Jim felt something other than sorrow. He felt hope. He felt like there was a future worth fighting for. He had Blaze to thank for that. One evening after a long walk in the snow, Jim sat down on the porch, Blaze curled up next to him. The puppy's soft fur pressed against his side, and Jim leaned back, looking up at the starry sky. The world felt quieter, calmer than it had in a long time. And for the first time in 12 years, Jim felt at peace. He wasn't healed yet. He knew that. But with Blaze by his side, and with Maggie slowly opening up again, Jim felt like he was finally on the path to healing. He was no longer the man he had been after David's death, the hollow man who had shut out the world and lost his way. He was starting to become someone new, someone who could move forward, who could rediscover the joy in life. Blaze had given him that. And for the first time, Jim felt ready to live again. Jim sat quietly on the porch, Blaze's warm body nestled beside him as the cold night air swept across the yard. The stars above, so clear in the crisp winter sky, seemed to sparkle just a little brighter tonight. The puppy's steady breathing against his leg was a calming rhythm, a reminder that after all the pain, there was still life, still warmth, still love to be found. In the weeks that followed their quiet conversation about rebuilding their life together, Jim began to realize something profound. It wasn't just that Blaze had become a companion for him or that the dog had provided comfort during the hardest moments. It was something deeper. Blaze, in all his innocence and simplicity, had become the bridge between the past and the future, between the grief that had once consumed Jim and the hope that was now slowly taking root in his heart. Blaze wasn't just a dog. He was David's final gift. David's plan to bring Jim and Maggie back from the edge. The puppy had given them a reason to fight again. More importantly, he had given them something to share, something to focus on together. Jim watched as Blaze trotted happily into the house, his ears perked up, his tail wagging. The puppy had a way of bringing life to the most mundane moments, infusing the house with a joy that had been absent for far too long. Even Maggie, who had been so distant in recent years, was beginning to smile again. She had started sitting on the couch in the evenings, sometimes with Blaze curled up at her feet, and for the first time in a long time, they shared quiet, peaceful moments together. It wasn't just the dog that had brought them closer. It was the act of caring for something again. For the first time since David's death, Jim and Maggie were working together side by side to nurture something to heal. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't immediate, but with every day it felt like a small piece of the puzzle was falling back into place. One evening after dinner, Jim sat beside Maggie on the couch, Blaze resting at their feet. He glanced over at her, watching her absent-mindedly scratch behind Blaze's ears. There was a softness in her touch, a tenderness that Jim hadn't seen in years. She looked up at him and smiled, a quiet, genuine smile. "We're doing better, aren't we?" Maggie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jim nodded, his eyes never leaving her. "Yeah, we are. It's not perfect, but it's better." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a sigh escaping her lips. "I didn't know if we'd ever get here. I didn't know if I could ever forgive you, or myself." Jim's hand found hers, squeezing it gently. "I don't think I ever really forgave myself either. Not until now." Maggie looked up at him, her eyes filled with unspoken words. "I'm sorry, Jim. For shutting you out. For shutting us out." "I'm sorry too," Jim replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been here. I should have seen what was happening to you." The silence between them was comfortable now, full of understanding and unspoken forgiveness. Blaze's soft whine from the floor broke the moment, and both Jim and Maggie laughed softly. The dog had a way of knowing when they needed him, when the tension in the room needed to be broken. "David would have been happy, you know," Jim said quietly, his gaze fixed on Blaze. "He always wanted us to be together. He knew somehow that we'd need something to help us get through." Maggie's eyes glistened with tears. "He always understood us better than we understood ourselves." Jim nodded. "Blaze, he's part of that, part of David's plan, and he's given us a chance to heal. Together." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in years, Jim felt like he was looking toward a future. It wasn't the future he had once envisioned, not the one where David would be there with them, but it was a future nonetheless. A future where they could still find joy, love, and healing even in the wake of loss. Blaze let out a contented sigh and rolled over onto his back, his paws in the air. Jim reached down, rubbing his belly, the warmth of the moment seeping into his soul. This small puppy, with his unwavering trust and endless love, had brought them back together, had saved them in ways they hadn't even realized they needed. They were on a new path now, a path of healing and rediscovery, and Blaze had shown them that even the darkest days could give way to light. The following morning, Jim found himself sitting at the kitchen table, the soft sound of Blaze's breathing filling the space around him. The puppy was curled up in his usual spot, a peaceful presence after the storm of emotions that had raged through their lives in the past few weeks. Jim's mind was still racing, but now it was about something different. It was about facing the past, a past that was tangled with guilt, regret, and a truth that needed to be spoken. He had received a call earlier that morning from Dennis Walsh. The message was clear: Dennis wanted to meet. Jim didn't know what to expect. After everything that had been revealed, after all the secrets Dennis had kept buried, Jim wasn't sure where their conversation would lead. But deep down, he knew they couldn't keep avoiding it. Dennis needed to face the truth. And Jim, in his own way, needed to understand why things had gone so terribly wrong. Jim had seen Dennis at the clinic once or twice, but those were fleeting encounters. Nothing that had required a conversation. Now, with Blaze resting at his feet, Jim felt it was time. The small steps they had taken toward healing, the slow rebuilding of his relationship with Maggie, had given him a sense of clarity. He could no longer carry the weight of unanswered questions. When Dennis arrived, he looked even more worn than Jim remembered. His face was gaunt, his eyes tired, as if the years of grief had hollowed him out. He walked slowly, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of his past still pressed on him. But when he looked at Jim, there was something different, an acknowledgement, a quiet plea for understanding. They sat at the kitchen table, the silence between them stretching until it felt almost unbearable. Finally, Dennis spoke, his voice low but steady. "I don't know where to start," Dennis admitted, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. "I've carried this with me for so long, Jim. The guilt, the shame. I never thought I'd be able to face it, but I know I have to. I've been hiding from it for years." Jim's gaze softened as he looked at his old friend. "You've been hiding from it, but it's been eating away at you, hasn't it?" Dennis nodded, his eyes flickering with the memory of his daughter's death. "When Sarah died in that fire, I froze. I couldn't save her. And I couldn't live with myself after that, so I started doing things, stupid things, setting fires, trying to prove I was brave, that I could face the flames again, that I could do something right for once. But I was wrong. All I did was make things worse." Jim felt a pang in his chest as he listened. He had known Dennis was struggling, but hearing the depth of his pain, the shame that had driven him to commit those reckless acts, it hit Jim harder than he expected. "I didn't know it would lead to all this," Dennis continued, his voice cracking. "I never meant for Blaze to get involved. I never meant for him to be caught in that fire, for you to find him. But in some twisted way, I think maybe it was meant to be. I think David knew something. He knew you'd need him. He knew I had to face my own demons, and he put this plan in motion." Jim's eyes searched Dennis's face. There it was again. The connection to David. The realization that everything had been leading to this moment. David had planned for Jim's healing even in death, and Dennis had been a part of it. He had been part of a plan not just to punish himself, but to allow Jim to heal, to forgive. "You didn't set that fire to hurt anyone," Jim said quietly. "You set it because you were trying to fix yourself. But that doesn't mean you're beyond redemption, Dennis. None of us are." Dennis's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment he looked younger, less burdened by the years of grief. "I don't know if I deserve redemption, Jim, but I'm trying. I'm trying to make things right." Jim nodded, the weight of the conversation settling between them. "We all have our burdens, Dennis, and we all need help carrying them. You've spent years running from your past, but maybe it's time to stop running. It's time to face the truth, all of it. For a long time, neither man spoke. The room was heavy with the unspoken truth, the acknowledgement of their shared pain. And yet, there was something else now. A tentative bridge between them, a glimmer of understanding. "Let's start over," Jim said, finally, his voice firm. "Let's work on healing, together." Dennis nodded, his face softening as he finally allowed himself to let go of the guilt that had held him captive for so long. The days that followed were filled with a cautious optimism. Jim could feel it in the air, in the way Maggie was starting to sit up more, the way her eyes, though still tired, seemed to regain a little of their spark. The chemotherapy had drained her, yes, but there was something different about this time. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for the life she and Jim had once dreamed about, the life they'd put on hold for so many years. Blaze's presence in their home had changed everything. It was subtle at first, just small moments. Maggie smiling when the puppy gently nuzzled her, her laugh soft, but real as Blaze tried to chew on her slipper. Jim had never seen Maggie laugh like that in months. The weight that had hung between them seemed a little lighter. The puppy had brought them something they didn't know they needed. A connection. A reason to look forward to tomorrow. Blaze wasn't just a dog, he was a symbol. A symbol of survival, of overcoming, of moving forward despite the odds. Jim had begun to notice the shift in Maggie. Her morning routines were no longer weighed down with the heaviness of chemotherapy appointments or the ever-looming uncertainty of her diagnosis. Instead, she found joy in the small things. The feel of Blaze's fur beneath her fingers, the way the puppy's eyes followed her around the house, always waiting for her to notice him. Jim couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for Blaze. The puppy had saved him, yes, but he had saved Maggie too. It wasn't just about his companionship, it was about the life he breathed back into their broken family. Maggie had started walking around the house more, taking short trips to the store, and most importantly, she had started talking again. They talked about everything from their hopes for the future to memories of David. But it was in these quiet moments when they sat together in the living room with Blaze curled up on the rug that Jim felt the weight of their shared loss start to lift. For the first time in a long while, there was hope. Hope that they could heal, that they could come together and rebuild what had been shattered. It was a fragile hope, but it was real. Jim found himself watching Maggie more closely now, noting the small signs of improvement, the way her face seemed less drawn, the way she would hold Blaze and let out a soft sigh of contentment. Jim was beginning to see the woman he had fallen in love with again, not as the one broken by grief, but as someone capable of finding joy even in the darkest moments. One evening after dinner, Maggie sat down with Blaze at her feet. Jim joined her on the couch, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The puppy, now more confident and playful, leaped up and snuggled between them. The three of them sat together in the quiet of the evening, a moment of peace that Jim had longed for. "I'm feeling better," Maggie said softly, her voice almost tentative. "I don't know if it's the treatment or if it's just Blaze, but I think I'm starting to feel like myself again." Jim smiled, a deep, aching smile that reached his eyes. "I think we both are," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're getting there, Maggie, together." Blaze, who had been quietly nestled between them, let out a small yawn and stretched his tail, thumping softly against the floor. It was a small sound, but to Jim it felt like a promise of better days ahead, of healing, of hope that wasn't just fleeting. They had a long road ahead of them, but with Blaze by their side, Jim felt that they were finally on the right path. The road to recovery wouldn't be easy, and there would still be days filled with pain and uncertainty, but there was something in Jim's heart that told him they could face it. Together. With the love and strength they had found, with Blaze's gentle presence as their guide, they had a chance to rebuild their lives. As the days passed, Jim began to realize that the healing he had started was more than just about himself. It was about honoring David. It was about fulfilling the dream his son had set in motion all those years ago, the dream that David had believed in even before his untimely death. Jim had always thought he would be able to step away from his life as a firefighter and simply enjoy his retirement. But now, with Blaze by his side, he saw that his work wasn't done yet. Not just for himself, but for the legacy David had left behind. David had always cared deeply about the people around him, about helping those who had been broken, those who had suffered. He had seen how his father had struggled with grief after the death of his son, how the fire department was not just a job, but a way for Jim to escape to hide from the pain. But David had known what Jim would need long before Jim did. And the more Jim thought about it, the more he realized that his son had also seen the deep struggles of first responders, of people like himself, Dennis, and so many others who had given their lives to a job that often left them scarred emotionally and mentally. David's dream, Jim now understood, wasn't just about him finding something to live for after his retirement. It was about creating something bigger, a place that could help others heal just as he had been given a second chance with Blaze. It was time to start the K9 Training Center. With Maggie's support, Jim had begun the process of setting up a facility where first responders could come to heal, a place where they could bond with specially trained therapy dogs and begin to deal with their trauma in a healthy, constructive way. He had already spoken to a few fellow firefighters, some of them veterans, who were on board with the idea. They saw what Blaze had done for Jim, how the puppy had helped him rediscover purpose, and they wanted to be part of the journey too. Jim started gathering resources. He contacted trainers, veterinarians, and people who specialized in canine therapy. He was setting up something that would not only honor David's memory, but would offer hope and healing to others who had suffered in silence. His heart swelled with pride as he realized that this was more than just a project. It was a legacy. David's legacy. One afternoon, as Jim walked through the empty building that would soon become the center, he felt a surge of emotion. It wasn't just the walls that would soon house New Hope. It was the spirit of David that seemed to fill the space, urging him forward. The building was cold and empty now, but Jim could already see it filled with life. He could see first responders, exhausted, broken, and afraid, finding solace and healing in the very dogs they had once been too proud to admit they needed. The idea of honoring David through this center had come from a place of love, but now as Jim walked through the rooms of what would become a new sanctuary for those who had given so much, he realized how deeply this center would heal him too. The work wasn't just for others. It was for him. It was for Maggie. It was for Blaze. It was for David. The dream Jim had been given, the dream David had started, was beginning to take shape. He could already hear the laughter of dogs, the low hum of conversations between survivors, the gentle whine of puppies finding their way into the hearts of those who needed them most. He looked down at Blaze, who trotted happily beside him, tail wagging as always. Jim smiled. This wasn't just about keeping a promise to his son. It was about building a future, one that was full of purpose, full of healing, and full of hope. Months had passed since Jim had first walked through the empty building, the space that would become the David Harrison Memorial K9 Training Center. The walls that had once been bare and cold were now filled with life and purpose. The scent of fresh paint and wood had been replaced by the comforting smell of dogs, fur, earth, and the subtle warmth of companionship. Jim stood in the doorway watching as Blaze ran happily through the center, his tail wagging furiously as he interacted with the trainers, the first responders, and the puppies who had come to find their purpose in this place. The center had become everything Jim had hoped it would be, and more. It was a sanctuary for those who had given so much, a place where the pain of their past could be acknowledged, shared, and slowly, but surely, healed. Jim could see it in their eyes, the first responders who walked in broken, weary, and lost. And he could see it in the way they left. More whole, more confident, more ready to face the world once again. It wasn't just the dogs who were healing. It was Jim, too. With every new person who came to the center, every story of pain and survival that was shared, Jim felt the weight of his own grief lessen. It didn't disappear, not entirely, but it became easier to carry. The journey was long, and some days were harder than others, but with Blaze by his side, with Maggie's quiet support, and with the memory of David guiding him, Jim began to feel a peace he hadn't known in years. On a quiet evening, Jim and Maggie sat together on the porch watching Blaze chase after a stick in the yard. The sky was painted with soft hues of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in a long time, Jim felt the weight of the past ease, and the future seemed a little less daunting. The silence between him and Maggie was no longer uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, with a shared love for each other, for David, and for the life they were rebuilding. "Look at him," Maggie said softly, her eyes following Blaze's movements as he ran in circles, the puppy's energy seemingly endless. "He's come such a long way." Jim smiled, nodding. "We all have." Maggie looked at him, her expression soft and contemplative. "I'm proud of you, Jim, for everything. For the center, for us, for Blaze. You've done more than I ever thought possible." Jim took her hand in his fingers brushing gently against hers. "We've done it together, Maggie. This is as much your doing as mine. You fought your own battles, and we're both still standing." They sat in silence for a while, the quiet hum of the world around them calming their minds. Blaze finally dropped the stick at their feet, panting happily. Jim bent down to rub his belly, feeling the warmth of the puppy's fur beneath his hand. "You know," Jim said, his voice soft but filled with conviction, "David would be proud. I can almost hear him saying, 'I knew you'd get here.'" Maggie nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He'd be proud. I think he knew we'd be okay eventually." Jim nodded, looking out over the yard where the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the snow-covered ground. There was peace in the stillness of the evening, a peace that had eluded him for so long. He had fought through grief, loss, and uncertainty. He had been broken, but now, with Maggie by his side, with Blaze's unwavering loyalty, and with the memory of David's love and foresight guiding him, Jim could finally say he was whole again. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to face, but for the first time, Jim felt ready. He had found his purpose again, and with Blaze by his side, there was nothing they couldn't face together. As the last light of the day faded from the sky, Jim leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. For the first time in 12 years, he allowed himself to truly rest. They had made it, together, and the journey had only just begun. The journey of Jim, Maggie, and Blaze is a testament to the incredible power of love, resilience, and the profound bond between humans and animals. In a world often weighed down by grief and hardship, their story shines as a reminder that healing can come from the most unexpected places, even from a small, unwavering German Shepherd puppy. Blaze, with his loyalty and gentle spirit, became more than just a pet. He was a symbol of redemption, a living reminder that even in the face of overwhelming loss, there is hope. His presence in Jim and Maggie's lives not only helped them find their way back to each other, but also sparked a movement that would touch countless others, the David Harrison Memorial Canine Training Center. Through this center, Jim is given back to the community that supported him, offering a place for first responders and others dealing with trauma to heal and find new purpose just as he did. This story reminds us of the immense value animals bring to our lives. German Shepherds, known for their intelligence and unwavering loyalty, serve not just as working dogs, but as companions, healers, and silent guardians of the human heart. Their presence teaches us the importance of unconditional love, trust, and the quiet power of companionship. Jim and Maggie's story, intertwined with Blaze's gift, shows that it's never too late to rebuild, to find joy, and to embrace a new chapter in life. Through their journey, we learn that love, whether between humans or with our loyal animal companions, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds, and that every step forward, no matter how small, is worth celebrating.